The air was thick with the aroma of rain, the kind of earthy humidity that settles before a storm. I stood in the doorway of the ancient Star Hollow Manor, peering at the dark sky and listening to the distant rumble of thunder. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The objective had been simple: spend a quiet weekend here as the rest of the family gathered at the reunion. But now, with the storm rolling in, the house felt far too enormous for simply me. I couldn't help but feel a tinge of sorrow for not going. And then there was Elias. He had arrived suddenly that morning, his relaxed manner and easy grin catching me off guard. "Automobile difficulty," he had remarked with a shrug, putting his duffel bag onto the ancient leather couch. Guests were roommates for the weekend. Elias was my second cousin, or at least that's what we called it. In truth, there was no blood relation, simply a convoluted network of family relationships that made him a part of my world. We'd always been nice yet distant. I hadn't seen him in years, and the man standing before me now was significantly different from the youngster I remembered him as: taller, broader, with a serene confidence that seemed to fill the room. His black hair was unkempt, as if he just rolled out of bed, and his hazel eyes conveyed a spark of mischief that made it impossible to look away. He wore a plain gray t-shirt and pants, but the way the fabric clung to his form made it evident he'd spent the last few years taking care of himself. I felt a flare of something I couldn't quite name: curiosity, maybe, or something more risky. I pushed it aside, telling myself it was just the awkwardness of being alone with someone I barely know. But as the day drew on, the flicker grew greater, harder to ignore. The storm hit just after dusk, the wind howling through the trees and the rain pounding against the windows. The power went out shortly after, putting the house into darkness. I struggled for my phone, the dim glow of its illumination just enough to traverse the unfamiliar space. "Looks like we're roughing it," Elias stated, his voice carrying easily over the roar of the storm. He located an old lantern in the cupboard and lit it, the warm warmth casting shimmering shadows on the walls. It felt uncomfortably intimate, the two of us nestled together in the dark light, the storm raging outside. The home was cold without power, and the only room with a functioning fireplace was upstairs. Elias carried the lantern as we made our way up, his presence firm and calming. The bedroom was modest but pleasant, with a large bed nicely positioned beside the hearth. "Only one bed," Elias replied, his tone light but his eyes carrying a flash of something unreadable. I hesitated, my pulse rising. "It's fine," I said immediately, attempting to seem casual. "It's just for one night." He nodded, setting the lantern on the nightstand before crouching to start the fire. I watched him work, his hands steady as he stacked the wood and struck a match. The fire ignited immediately, dancing in the hearth and illuminating the room with a beautiful golden light. The heat was a pleasant reprieve from the frost, and I came closer, stroking my arms for warmth. Elias gazed up at me, his gaze lingering for a moment before he glanced away. "You should get comfortable," he said, his voice low. "It's going to be a long night." I nodded, instantly conscious of how chilly and damp my clothing was. I took my suitcase and rushed into the bathroom, my hands quivering as I changed into the only dry clothes I had, a loose tank top and a pair of shorts that seemed far too casual in this setting. When I returned, Elias was laid out on the bed, his arm curled behind his head as he stared at the fire. He'd taken off his clothing, and the sight of him caught me off guard. His chest was wide and well-defined, his skin catching the firelight in a way that made my breath hitch. I stopped at the doorway, my heart racing. He turned his head to look at me, his expression unreadable. "All yours," he said, gesturing to the bed. I nodded, pushing my legs to move as I crossed the room. The bed sank slightly as I climbed in, the gap between us feeling incredibly small. I lay on my side, facing away from him, but I could feel the heat of his body alongside me, the slight aroma of his skin lingering in the air. The storm outside appeared to grow louder, the wind rattling the windows and the rain beating against the house. Yet inside, all was silent, too quiet. My thoughts were loud in the silence, my mind racing with memories of the way his gaze had lingered on me, the warmth of his words, the way his presence seemed to fill the room. I adjusted, the movement slightly leading my arm to brush against his. The contact was light and momentary, yet it sent a spark through me, my flesh tingling where we touched. I froze, my heart beating while I waited for him to react. He didn't move, but I could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. I wondered if he was lying awake too, his mind running like mine. The thought made my chest tighten, a mix of terror and something else, something I wasn't ready to identify. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows on the walls, and I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. All I could think of was the warmth of him alongside me, the way his presence seemed to wrap around me like a blanket. I told myself it was simply the storm, just the peculiar conditions of the night, but deep inside, I knew it was more than that. And as the night wore on, I couldn't help but wonder, was he feeling it too, or was it all in my head? The storm outside showed no signs of relenting, the wind howling and rain pelting at the windows in an unceasing rhythm. Inside, the fire crackled quietly, creating wavering light that danced across the walls. It should have felt comforting, this modest haven from the mayhem outside, but all I could feel was the weight of his presence beside me. Elias was laid out on the bed, his body relaxed in a way that only made me more aware of how tense I was. He lay on his back, one arm thrown over his head, the other resting lazily at his side. His exposed chest rose and fell with each steady breath, the golden glow of the fire lightly emphasizing the strong contours of his muscles and the slight gloss of his skin. I tried to focus on anything else, the sound of the storm, the feel of the blanket beneath my fingers, the shadows changing on the ceiling, but my attention kept straying back to him. There was something magnetic about the way he inhabited the room, so effortlessly at ease while I felt like I was unraveling. I drew the blanket more around me, suddenly too aware of how little I was wearing. The thin straps of my tank top had slipped slightly off my shoulders, and the hem barely skimmed the tops of my thighs. My shorts, soft and loose, felt like they presented no barrier at all between my skin and the cool air. I shuffled awkwardly, trying to avoid drawing attention to myself, but every movement felt accentuated in the stillness. "You okay?" His voice burst through my thoughts, low and soft, with just enough concern to make my cheeks flush. "Yeah," I answered quickly, attempting a smile. "Just cold." He turned his head to look at me, his hazel eyes catching the light in a way that made my breath quicken. "Come closer to the fire," he suggested, his voice nonchalant, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I hesitated, but before I could react, he shifted, pulling himself up on one elbow and reaching for the blanket. The movement drew him closer, and I caught a whiff of his scent, clean, masculine, with a subtle hint of something woodsy that made my stomach flutter. "Here," he said, pulling the edge of the blanket out to me. "We can share." I paused for a moment longer, my thoughts racing with all the reasons why this was a poor decision. Yet the warmth of the fire wasn't enough to chase away the chill, and the notion of sitting there shivering and alone was worse. I nodded, edging closer until I was almost within reach of the blanket. He shifted again, throwing it over both of us, and the bed dipped slightly under his weight. The sudden proximity made my heart pound, the space between us now so short that it felt like every breath I took might bridge the gap. I attempted to focus on the fire, on the steady crackle of the logs, but I was vividly aware of every minute detail, the rub of the blanket on my arm, the faint heat coming from his flesh, the sound of his breathing barely inches away. "You're still shivering," he murmured, his voice quieter now, just a murmur, and I felt it. "I'm fine," I lied, yet my body betrayed me with another involuntary shudder. He sighed, the sound conveying a tone of exasperation. "Come here," he replied, shifting again. Before I could protest, his arm was around me, tugging me closer until I was pressed against his side. The warmth of his skin was immediately overwhelming, and I froze, unsure of what to do. "Relax," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. "It's merely to keep you warm." I nodded, my cheek brushing across his shoulder as I tried to find a comfortable posture, but there was no comfort to be found, not with the way my heart was racing or the way my skin seemed to tingle everywhere we touched. His arm rested lightly across my shoulders, his fingers brushing against my bare flesh in a way that felt unintended but impossibly intimate. I closed my eyes, attempting to steady my breathing, but the proximity was too much. The heat of him seeped into me, his aroma filled my senses, and I couldn't think of anything else. My mind raced with thoughts I couldn't control, questions I didn't dare ask. If he felt it too, this tension that seemed to pulse in the air between us, or was it just me, my loneliness and my vivid imagination turning the moment into something it wasn't? I shifted slightly, the movement causing my thigh to brush against his. His muscles stiffened for just a moment before relaxing again, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite describe, guilt, maybe, or something deeper. I told myself it was nothing, simply an accident, but the way my body reacted suggested otherwise. The fire crackled again, louder this time, breaking the silence. I opened my eyes, my gaze moving up to his face. He was staring at the ceiling, his expression opaque, but there was a stiffness in his jaw that hadn't been there before. "Elias," I whispered gently, my voice scarcely more than a whisper. He turned his head to look at me, his eyes locking onto mine for a moment. Neither of us spoke, the stillness between us heavy and charged. His gaze was focused, searching, as if he were trying to read my thoughts, to see what I wasn't saying. "Sure," he murmured finally, his voice low and hoarse. "Nothing," I answered hastily, glancing away, my cheeks flushed, and I felt a rush of embarrassment slam over me. What had I been about to say? What did I think I could ask? He didn't press me, didn't say anything more, yet the silence that followed was different, heavier, as if we both knew there was something hanging between us, something neither of us was ready to address. As the night drew on, I found myself inching closer to him, lured to his warmth and the steady comfort of his presence. And though I told myself it was just the cold, just the circumstances, I couldn't shake the sensation that it was more than that. As I finally fell off to sleep, it was with my head lying against his shoulder, his arms still draped loosely around me. And when the fire burnt low, spreading its gentle glow over the room, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd crossed a line or if the line had been there long before I realized it was there. The night seemed impossibly still, save for the subtle crackle of the dying fire and the faint cadence of Elias's breathing beside me. The storm had settled into a steady rain, a quiet patter against the glass that should have been pleasant, but it wasn't. The air in the room felt heavy, dense with something I couldn't quite define. I lay there, still, staring at the light shadows dancing on the ceiling, every cell of my being hyper-aware of him. His warmth spread across the little gulf between us, an unseen thread dragging me closer even as I battled to retain my distance. My heart hammered in my chest, so loud I was sure he could hear it. I told myself it was just the storm, just the peculiar events of the night, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't about the weather or the scenario, it was about him. I shifted slightly, the movement causing the blanket to drag across my flesh. The fabric brushed against my bare shoulder, a little sensation, but it sent a shudder through me nonetheless. Every nerve in my body felt alive, vibrating with an energy I didn't comprehend but couldn't ignore. Beside me, Elias twitched, his arm brushing lightly across mine. The sensation was brief, unintentional, but it was enough to set my pulse pounding. My skin burned where we had touched, the sensation lingering long after he had relaxed back into stillness. I bit my lip, attempting to steady my breathing, but it was no use. I tilted my head slightly, my gaze dropping, watching him in the dim firelight. He was sleeping on his back, one arm thrown lazily across his chest, the other resting against the cushion. His face was relaxed, his eyes closed, but there was a tightness in his face that hadn't been there before. Was he asleep, or was he lying awake like me, wrestling with thoughts he didn't dare ponder? The question persisted in my mind, mocking me. I wanted to reach out, to touch him, to see if he would respond, but I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I lay there, transfixed in the quiet, my mind swirling in perilous directions. The flickering illumination of the fire formed shadows across his skin, accentuating the curve of his jaw, the strength in his shoulders, and the steady rise and fall of his chest. He appeared quiet, even placid, but I knew better. There was something beneath the surface, something latent yet elusive. I shut my eyes in an attempt to dispel my thoughts, but it was futile. Whenever I attempted to concentrate on an alternative, the rain, the distant rumble of thunder, I found myself returning to him, the manner in which his presence permeated the room, the manner in which his fragrance persisted in the atmosphere, the manner in which my body appeared to react to him autonomously. It transcended mere attraction. It was an underlying intensity, a perilous essence. He had the ability to make me feel acknowledged, even in his absence of gaze. His voice enveloped me like a comforting blanket, both calming and disarming, reflecting his demeanor, self-assured yet modest, as though he was oblivious to the impact he had on me. Or perhaps he did. I shifted once again, my thigh contacting his leg. It was ephemeral, yet it sufficed to send a jolt to my being, acute and electrifying. I held my breath, waiting for him to move or to verbally acknowledge what had happened, but he remained silent. The quiet lingered, dense and suffocating, until I could no longer endure it. "Elias," I muttered, my voice scarcely perceptible. Initially, there was no response, leading me to believe he might not have heard me. But he subsequently turned his head, his gaze aligning with mine in the subdued illumination. His gaze possessed an intensity and inscrutability that caused my breath to falter. Indeed, he spoke gently, his voice deep and gravelly, as if he had just awakened. I paused, my thoughts whirling. What was I trying to articulate? That I was unable to cease contemplating him. That the void between us seemed both a gap and a thread, drawing me nearer while yet maintaining distance. I was uncertain about my desires, merely aware that I had a longing, something. "Nothing," I eventually articulated, the word catching in my throat. Under his gaze, he remained on me for an additional second, and I perceived a slight quiver at the corner of his mouth, as though he were suppressing a smile. "Are you certain?" he inquired, his tone buoyant yet tinged with an underlying intensity. In that peculiar manner, my cheeks flushed with warmth. "Really, I am certain." He did not exert pressure on me, remained silent, but the expression in his eyes lingered with me long after he departed. I looked aside and settled back onto the pillow, my heart thumping. My mind was a tumult of unnamed feelings. The room felt excessively confined and warm, overwhelmed by unexpressed anxiety. I felt compelled to rise and create distance. I was unable to move, immobilized by my own thoughts. As the night progressed, I felt the subtle allure of his presence approaching him, compelled by an inexplicable power. I reassured myself it was the cold, necessitated warmth, yet I understood that it was not the cold that defined my longing for his proximity. It was he. And as the initial rays of dawn began to emerge, peering through the curtains, I pondered whether this marked the inception of anything significant or the commencement of an era I was unable to reclaim. The chamber was enveloped in profound silence, interrupted solely by the subdued crackle of the final embers in the fireplace and the gentle cadence of our respiration. The storm had abated, transitioned into a persistent drizzle, yet the tension in the room persisted unabated, akin to an unacknowledged reality that neither of us had the courage to articulate. I reclined on my side, gazing at the subdued light, the illumination of the firelight on the wall, each muscle in my body tense, every nerve alert. Elias was positioned beside me, so closely that I could perceive the subtle warmth emanating from him beneath the shared blanket. His breathing was slow and regular, however, I could not ascertain if he was asleep or merely lying quiet, absorbed in contemplation like myself. I was unable to vocalize, and I refrained from gazing at him, fearing the consequences of doing so. I observed something in his gaze that rendered it impossible to remain quiet, impossible to feign indifference to my feelings. The tension between us was palpable. My body, despite its betrayal, resonated with his every essence, his presence, the pressure of his arm on the bed, the slight movement of his leg against mine, the aroma of his skin, clean and manly with a little undertone of something profound, earthy, and comforting. It was both addictive and overwhelming. No matter how diligently I attempted to concentrate on alternative subjects, my thoughts incessantly reverted to him. I shifted slightly, attempting to adjust without disrupting the delicate equilibrium of the moment. Instead, the movement resulted in the blanket slipping down, exposing my shoulder, and the crisp air elicited a shudder. As I attempted to reposition the blanket, I sensed his touch, light and reluctant, graze my arm, as if he were uncertain whether to withdraw or remain. My breath halted in my throat, the contact eliciting a jolt that surged through me, both electrifying and horrifying, prompting me to shift my head slightly, only sufficient to perceive him in the dim firelight. His eyes were open, observing me, and the intensity in his glance was sufficient to deprive me of breath. "Are you all right?" he inquired gently, his voice low and raspy, as if he had been suppressing his words for an extended period. I nodded, unable to articulate a response. His hand, his fingers, remained on my arm, their warmth on my flesh creating a connection that was simultaneously innocent and electrifying, delineating a boundary in the sand that neither of us appeared inclined to traverse or retreat from. "You are shivering," he remarked, his tone now gentler, nearly a whisper. "I am fine," I articulated, yet the utterances appeared feeble and unpersuasive, even to my own perception. He remained still, refraining from withdrawing his hand. Rather, he inched closer to the bed, the gap between us vanishing as he leaned slightly forward. I could sense his heat, the consistent warmth of his body in contact with mine. My pulse raced, and my breath caught in my chest as I struggled to maintain my calm. "The temperature is only low," I appended, the rationale which appeared tenuous, yet it was all I possessed. Elias's lips formed a subtle, nearly undetectable smile, and for an instant, he gazed at me as if he could perceive beyond the exterior, penetrating to the thoughts I was fervently attempting to conceal. "There is no need for pretense," he stated softly, his tone both tender and resolute, akin to him extending a lifeline that I was uncertain about accepting. The words lingered, the atmosphere between us laden with articulated tension, and I sensed my determination starting to disintegrate. I desired to avert my attention, to disrupt the moment, but I was unable. His stare captivated me, stationary, firm, and resolute, and for the first time, I permitted myself to recognize the fact I had been evading all night. I was not trembling due to the cold. I was shaking due to him. Without contemplation, I extended my fingers upward, the contact gentle as they brushed over his palm resting on my arm, preliminary, yet sufficient to deliver another acute shock to me. Undeniably, he did not withdraw. Rather, his hand moved, his fingers gliding to intertwine with mine, his grasp secure yet gentle, as though he anticipated I would refrain from pushing him away. The firelight danced, creating shadows across his face. I observed an expression that caused my heart to ache, vulnerability, a query, a subdued longing that reflected my own. The moment felt both suspended in time and simultaneously delicate and boundless, and I realized that, regardless of what transpired subsequently, there would be no return. He advanced his unencumbered hand, his thumb gliding along my jawline, brushing against my cheek. It was warm and tender, causing my breath to catch in my throat. I shut my eyes, yielding to his fingers against my will. The burden of the moment weighed heavily upon me like a tidal wave. I whispered the name, Elias, little perceptible, yet it conveyed all the uncertainty, all the trepidation, all the need I was unable to articulate. He did not respond, not verbally. Instead, he inclined toward me, his forehead gently touching mine, his breath warm against my skin. The world appeared to dissipate, the storm outside diminishing into a faraway murmur, while the firelight gently softened. Only he existed, only this instant, and the unarticulated reality that lingered, a tenuous connection between us. As I felt his lips graze my temple, ephemeral and transient, a query rather than a resolution, my heart quickened. My physique responded, quivering as I slightly moved my head, encountering his gaze again. His eyes examined my own, and I observed the identical conflict, the same yearning, and the same silent desperation I experienced. He followed with a gradual and intentional approach. Our initial contact with his lips was gentle, nearly tentative, as if he were affording me a final opportunity to withdraw. Yet I refrained. I was unable to. The deluge had commenced, and there was no halting what ensued. The kiss intensified, his hand entwining in my hair, his caress igniting a long-dormant passion within me. It was tremendous, all-consuming, a conflagration that eradicated the uncertainties and apprehensions, revealing solely the unrefined, unadulterated nature of our emotions. Upon our eventual separation, our breathing was labored and irregular. The space felt transformed, electrified, and vibrant forever. I gazed at him, my heart still pumping, and I realized that nothing would change. Leora Vane would never be the same. And as the fire crackled gently in the background, we could not help but ponder whether we had transgressed a boundary or merely discovered our true position we were destined to exist. The fire's glow illuminated more intensely than the flames themselves. The initial beams of sunlight infiltrated the drapes, illuminating the room with a gentle golden tint. It was the type of light that should have evoked warmth and comfort; instead, it rendered everything more acute. My eyelids gradually opened, the remnants of slumber still enveloping me, although it did not suffice to alleviate the pain in my chest or the tumultuous thoughts in my mind. Elias remained by my side. I sensed his presence before I turned my head, his steady breathing creating a subtle pattern that permeated the solitude. The events of the preceding night replayed in my head like a vivid dream, each moment increasingly intoxicating and more perplexing than the preceding. It lacked authenticity, but each glance, touch, and whispered phrase remained palpable in the atmosphere between us, dense and weighty. I adjusted slightly, the motion resulting in the blanket sliding down my shoulder, the cool air caressing my flesh. A slight tremor coursed through me as I sensed his presence beside me. The slightest movement of the mattress as he turned his head made my heart race, anticipation constricting my chest as I acknowledged his wakefulness, prompting me to risk a glimpse at him. My breath caught in my throat as our eyes connected. He was positioned on one elbow, his gaze unwavering and inscrutable as he scrutinized me. In the firelight from the previous night, it had dulled the contours of his visage, yet now, in the starkness of dawn, the intensity of his expression was inescapable. "Morning," he spoke softly, his voice low and hoarse from sleep. "Morning," I responded, just above a whisper. My cheeks burned beneath his gaze, prompting me to swiftly avert my eyes, my fingers fidgeting with the blanket's edge. The ensuing silence was overwhelming, laden with unspoken words. I sensed his gaze upon me, and it required all my will to refrain from turning back. The unarticulated weight of the night persisted between us, indisputable, and I was uncertain how to reconcile the disparity or if I ought to do it at all. "Are you all right?" he inquired, his tone soft yet inquisitive, causing my throat to constrict. I produced a feeble smile and replied swiftly, "Yes, I am fine," although the remarks seemed insincere as I articulated them. He appeared unconvinced, his stare remaining fixed on me for a little moment before he breathed slowly, his head reclining against the pillow. The tension in the room did not disappear, rather, it transformed into a quieter form, more reflective. "I did not intend for matters to become complicated," he finally stated, his voice so faint that I nearly failed to perceive it. The words impacted me profoundly. I experienced a harsh, bitter sensation in my chest and felt compelled to respond to him. I had not intended it either, but the words became lodged in my throat. Instead, I remained silent, my fingers clenching the blanket firmly as I gazed at the ceiling. "It was not unsatisfactory," he said, adjusting his tone accordingly, cautious, as though he were selecting his words with intention. I turned my head to regard him, my gaze probing his expression for perhaps some reassurance or comprehension, although his countenance was guarded, his eyes fixated on the ceiling as if he could not endure looking at me. "It was not unpleasant," I echoed, my voice scarcely audible. The syllables felt peculiar on my tongue, unfamiliar and delicate, yet they were the only words I could manage. He ultimately gazed at me, his hazel eyes becoming gentler as they encountered my own. Nonetheless, why does it seem as though he was the one who inquired, his voice laden with emotion, perhaps regret or anxiety? I lacked a definitive response. The reality was that I was unaware of the reason for that sensation. The evening had encompassed everything I desired, all I was unaware I required. However, in the severe morning light, it seemed that something had irrevocably altered between us. The vibration of his phone on the nightstand disrupted the silence, shocking us both. He swiftly reached for it, glanced at the screen, before murmuring a curse under his breath. "It's my father," he stated, sitting upright and running a hand through his hair. I nodded, unable to trust myself to articulate a response. He swung his legs over, positioned on the side of the bed, his back turned toward me while he responded to the call. His voice was subdued and steady, although I was unable to discern the words. All I could perceive was the throbbing of my own heart and the subdued tension that persisted in the room. After he ended the call, he did not turn back. He remained in place, his shoulders taut and his head lowered, as though he were engrossed in contemplation. I desired to extend my hand to him, to articulate something that would have facilitated this, but I was immobilized, ensnared by the burden of my personal emotions and the apprehension of exacerbating the situation. "Suggest that we should likely proceed," he stated finally, his tone neutral yet detached. "Yeah," I spoke gently, my voice seldom rising above a whisper. The remainder of the morning passed in a haze. We navigated around one another cautiously, as if unfamiliar individuals in the same environment, each interaction imbued with a nuance of unfamiliar stiffness. The unarticulated weight of the night remained palpable, and I could not dispel the sensation that an unidentifiable alteration had occurred, one I could not articulate yet could not overlook. As we got our things into the car and exited the driveway, the stillness between us was more oppressive than ever. I gazed outside the window, the familiar landscape of Belmont blurring as my mind raced with unanswerable questions. What actions had we undertaken? What was their significance? And, perhaps most crucially, where do we proceed from here? As the vehicle accelerated along the desolate road, I found myself contemplating whether our shared night marked either the conclusion of one chapter or the inception of an entirely new one. I glanced at him as the sun hung low on the horizon, its golden light forming elongated shadows as we entered the driveway. Shadows enveloped the tranquil street where the home remained, still and inconspicuous, a recognizable landmark that had consistently symbolized security and simplicity. However, today, while I remained seated in the vehicle alongside Elias, it felt like a watershed, a demarcation between the world we had shared over the past 2 days and the impending reality. I clutched the edge of my seat, my fingers pressed into the fabric as I sought to stabilize the tempest within me. My heart raced, each beat reverberating with the thoughts that had plagued me since the previous night. What actions had we taken? Elias had remained largely silent during the drive. He had maintained his gaze fixed on the road, hands firm on the steering wheel, countenance unreadable. The quiet between us was dense, laden with unexpressed emotions we were not articulating, and it had only intensified as we approached Belmont. The home loomed as he deactivated the engine and reclined in his seat. The burden of it was nearly intolerable. "We are present," he uttered gently, his voice faltering, akin to a ripple over placid water. "Yes," I responded, my own voice a little more than a whisper. Neither of us stirred. The atmosphere within the vehicle was oppressive and electric with an indefinable intensity. I sensed his presence beside me, radiating warmth, the subdued tension that appeared to resonate between us. I wished to articulate words intended for communication, but they became ensnared in my throat, intertwined with trepidation amidst the uncertainty. Elias exhaled softly, his fingers tapping gently. "So," he said, his tone casual, perhaps excessively so. "Do you want me to assist you with your bag?" "No," I replied. He nodded, his attention moving toward me as I swiftly shook my head and asserted, "I've got it." For a brief second, before he averted his gaze, there was a certain quality in his eyes, an intense and tumultuous emotion constricted my chest. As I extended my hand toward the door, I grasped the handle, my movements slow and deliberate, yet I hesitated before opening it. Contemplating the act of stepping outside, of traversing the threshold and departing from this peculiar, electrified sphere we had formed, was nearly intolerable. I looked at him once more, my fingers still positioned on the handle, and I discovered him observing me. "Elias," I commenced, my voice quivering slightly. "Last night," he raised a hand, interrupting me. "You need not say anything," he stated, his tone resolute yet gentle. "I comprehend." I blinked, my chest constricting further. "Did he?" He faltered in his gaze, briefly lowering his eyes before returning them to mine, admitting, "I don't know, perhaps," he trailed off, silently. Nevertheless, I recognize the complexity, and I am aware of our situation. Unable to comprehend, I inquired about his statement. He faltered, his words suspended in the atmosphere like an incomplete notion. I experienced a twinge of an acute and bittersweet sense of relief, perhaps accompanied by regret. He was uncertain whether to choose. Ultimately, he stated, "We cannot feign that it did not occur." "No," I responded, my voice scarcely audible. "We cannot." He agreed, his tone laden. The stillness that ensued was overwhelming, yet it was not devoid of substance. It was replete with all that we were unable to articulate, everything we were uncertain about how to confront. I desired to connect with him, to bridge the distance between us by touching him, although I refrained due to the considerable risk involved. The repercussions were excessively burdensome. He adjusted his position slightly, his hand grazing mine as it made contact with the console. The touch was subtle and transient, yet it transmitted a jolt that coursed through me, difficult to disregard. My breath halted, and my skin tingled where we had made contact. I sensed my determination starting to disintegrate. "Elias," I articulated once more, my voice more resolute. He turned to face me completely, his hazel eyes fixating on mine. There was something about his look, strong and probing, causing my heart to quicken. "What?" he requested softly, his tone nearly imploring. "I don't wish to express remorse for it. Don't proceed as I lack understanding of this concept and its implications." I swallowed hard, my throat constricted. I confessed my uncertainty, my voice faltered somewhat, "However, I am certain I do not wish to conclude in this manner." His jaw tightened, his eyes studying mine as if attempting to uncover the answers he could not articulate. He stated simply, his voice laden with frustration. "I acknowledge," I replied swiftly, "although that does not imply we disregard it." He emitted a subdued, acrid laugh, his head reclining on the seat. "This situation is exceedingly chaotic," he mumbled, his tone a blend of irritation, and I experienced a profound and acute sense of guilt. I suppressed it. "Perhaps that is so," I remarked, my voice quavering, "although that does not imply we have to exacerbate the situation." He glanced at me once more, his demeanor becoming gentler. "What actions should be taken?" he said softly. "Do you desire it?" The question lingered in the atmosphere, burdened and weighty. I had a constriction in my chest. What was my desire? The response resided just beneath the surface, yet I was too afraid to articulate it aloud. "I am uncertain," I eventually stated, my voice no louder than a whisper, "yet I am certain I do not wish to discard this, whatever it may be." He exhaled gently, his gaze dropping to the area. "Neither do I," he conceded quietly. The words were straightforward, yet they imposed a burden that enveloped me like a shroud. I experienced a glimmer of hope, delicate and ephemeral, yet it sufficed to stabilize me and provide me with the fortitude to re-establish eye contact. "We will resolve it," I stated with greater firmness this time. He nodded, his lips forming a subtle, bittersweet smile. "Indeed," he stated gently, "we shall." The sun descended on the horizon, illuminating the tranquil street of Belmont with its golden glow. I was compelled to contemplate what would follow. Could this signify the commencement of something novel, or the initiation of an endeavor we were unable to exert control over?